Hello family, before we start this intriguing story, we would like you to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so that you will be notified once we drop new story. Also comment the time and country you are watching from. The afternoon sun hung in the sky like a ball of fire, its heat pressing heavily on the crowded streets of Lagos. The smell of burning rubber mixed with the distant aroma of frying akara as traders shouted over one another, trying to sell their goods before nightfall. But despite the noise, the energy was different. It was not the lively Lagos of the rich, but the struggling Lagos of the poor. Women in faded wrappers sat by their stalls, watching customers pick up food items only to put them back after checking the price. Even those who managed to buy something did so with tight lips, knowing there was no certainty of another meal tomorrow. By the roadside, a thin man sat under a makeshift umbrella, pushing a rusty wheelbarrow filled with firewood. His eyes darted left and right, hoping someone, anyone, would call him for work. Across from him, a mother held her crying child close, whispering promises of food she didn't know how to fulfill. Lagos was a land of dreams, but for many, it was also a land of suffering. In a small, dimly lit room at the back of an old, crumbling house, Precious sat beside her mother, watching her stir a pot of watery soup. The kitchen was nothing more than a corner of their single-room apartment, with a small charcoal stove and a few cooking utensils. The room smelled of burnt onions and smoke, but for Precious, the real problem was the scarcity of food. She glanced at the soup again, just a few floating pieces of fishbone and one miserable-looking piece of meat. It wouldn't be enough for their family of four. Her father, a carpenter, sat on the bed, his shoulders slumped in frustration. "No work today," he muttered. "I even went to the market square, but all the furniture makers are complaining, no one is buying." Precious' younger brother, Junior, sat on the floor, playing with a worn-out toy car made from an old tin of Milo. His small stomach growled loudly, but he didn't say anything. He was used to it. Precious swallowed the lump in her throat. "Mama, what if we..." Her mother cut her off. "We will eat. We will survive. God will not forget us." But as the little family sat to share their small meal, they all knew the truth: survival was becoming harder every day. The next morning, Precious walked down the busy street, her stomach still grumbling from last night's unsatisfying meal. School was no longer an option for her parents couldn't afford the fees. So instead, she went to the market to see if she could help her mother sell tomatoes. As she made her way through the dusty road, she saw him again. The old beggar, Johnson. He sat near a broken fence, his back resting against the rough concrete wall. His clothes were torn, his skin pale, and his ribs stuck out from his chest. He barely had the strength to call out, but his weak voice still reached her ears. "Please, a little food, anything at all." People passed by without sparing him a glance. Some even stepped over his outstretched hand, as if he were nothing but dirt. Precious felt a sting in her heart. Every time she saw him, the same thought ran through her mind: what if that were me? But there was nothing she could do. She barely had enough food for herself. Or was there? That night, as she lay on her tin mattress, the thought of Johnson wouldn't leave her mind. She remembered how his hands shook when he begged, how his lips were cracked from thirst. She turned to face the ceiling, her stomach empty and her mind restless. Tomorrow, she would have only one meal, just one. But what if she gave it away? The idea made her heart race. Would her parents understand? Would she survive the night hungry? She had to make a decision. Would Precious risk her only meal to help a beggar who had nothing? Or would she put her own survival first? The sun had barely risen when Precious stepped out of the house, the cool morning air doing little to ease the hunger she felt from the night before. The streets were already bustling with activity, traders arranging their goods, children running barefoot, and bus conductors yelling at passengers. As she made her way towards the market, she saw him again. Johnson sat in his usual spot near the broken fence, his bony hands stretched out in silent plea. His head hung low, his lips dry and cracked. His clothes were nothing more than rags clinging to his thin frame, and his body shook slightly from weakness. Precious swallowed hard. Every day, she passed him. Every day, she felt guilty. But what could she do? She had nothing to offer. She turned her gaze away, quickening her pace. Yet, no matter how fast she walked, she couldn't outrun the feeling in her heart. At the market, Precious helped her mother arrange the small heap of tomatoes they were selling. Business was slow, as always. Many people stopped to ask for prices but walked away, their pockets too empty to buy. A woman picked up a tomato and frowned. "These are too expensive. Mama, should we reduce the price?" Precious whispered. Her mother shook her head. "If we sell cheaper, what will we eat?" Precious sighed. Everyone was struggling. Even those who seemed better off were only barely surviving. At noon, she took a break and walked around the market. Everywhere she looked, she saw signs of hardship. Children sat beside their mothers, their eyes dull from hunger. A young boy fought with a dog over a piece of leftover bread. A shoemaker sat idle, waiting for a customer who might never come. This was life in Lagos. Yet, through all this suffering, Precious knew one thing: she was still better off than Johnson. That evening, as Precious and her family sat for dinner, her father spoke in a tired voice. "I heard the government is planning something for the poor, but who knows when?" Her mother scoffed. "Government promises don't fill empty stomachs." Precious chewed her food slowly, deep in thought. She wanted to tell them about Johnson. She wanted to ask if they could spare something for him. But she already knew the answer. Their food was barely enough. Her mother caught her staring at her plate. "Eat up, my dear. You need strength for tomorrow." Precious nodded, but the food tasted like sand in her mouth. That night, as she lay on her mattress, Johnson's image haunted her. His trembling hands. His sunken eyes. The way people ignored him. Would he even survive another night? She had always wished to help, but she never had the means. Now, she did. Tomorrow, her mother would give her a small meal for lunch, her only meal of the day. The thought of going hungry scared her. But the thought of Johnson starving to death scared her even more. Would she dare? Would she give away her only meal, knowing she would have to sleep on an empty stomach? The morning sun peeked through the tiny cracks in the wooden window of Precious' house. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her stomach already protesting from hunger. Today was the day. Her mother handed her a small nylon bag containing a single piece of bread and a sachet of water. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. "Eat well, my dear," her mother said softly, brushing a hand over her hair. "You need energy to help in the market." Precious nodded, but her heart was heavy. She could already see Johnson's thin hands shaking as he begged for food. Could she really do this? As she walked down the street, she clutched her meal tightly, her palms sweating. The market was noisy, filled with the sounds of traders calling customers and bus conductors yelling for passengers. And then, she saw him. Johnson sat in his usual place, his head lowered. His hands were empty, no one had given him anything today. Precious slowed her steps, her heart racing. She felt a war inside her: eat and survive or give and suffer. She stepped closer, her hands trembling. "Excuse me, sir," she said in a small voice. Johnson's head lifted slowly. His sunken eyes met hers, filled with disbelief. She held out her meal. "Here. Take this." For a moment, he didn't move. Then, with shaky hands, he reached for the food. His fingers brushed against hers, rough and cold. "God bless you, my child," he whispered, tears pooling in his eyes. I don't know what to say." Precious forced a smile. "It's okay." She turned quickly before he could see the pain on her face. As she walked away, her stomach twisted in hunger. The smell of roasted corn from a roadside vendor made her mouth water. She had given away her only meal. By the time she reached the market, her head felt light. She tried to focus on arranging tomatoes, but her vision blurred. Her mother frowned. "Precious, what's wrong?" She shook her head. "Nothing, Mama." But inside, she knew she had a long, hungry night ahead. Scene 4, an unexpected gift. That evening, as she packed up the unsold tomatoes, a woman approached their store. "I have been watching you and your daughter," the woman said. "She is hardworking." Precious' mother forced a tired smile. "We are just trying to survive, Ma." The woman nodded and then did something shocking. She bought all the remaining tomatoes without bargaining. "This should help," she said, handing them the money. Precious and her mother stared in disbelief. As they walked home that night with more money than they had made in weeks, Precious felt a strange warmth in her heart. Had her act of kindness already begun to bring blessings? Could this be the beginning of something bigger, or was it just a coincidence? For the first time in a long while, Precious and her family had a good meal. The smell of well-seasoned soup filled their small room, and the sound of Junior smacking his lips made her smile. Her father, who usually ate in silence, let out a satisfied sigh. "This is how life should be," he said, scooping another spoonful of Gary. Her mother smiled, but her eyes were still clouded with worry. "This money will not last forever," she said. "We need more blessings." Precious remained quiet. Deep down, she felt something had changed. Maybe good things were finally coming their way. The next day, Precious helped her mother at the market as usual, but something unexpected happened. The woman who had bought all their tomatoes returned. She smiled at Precious. "My name is Madame Gloria," she introduced herself. "I own a small restaurant not far from here." Precious and her mother exchanged glances, unsure of what to say. "I need someone hardworking to help clean and assist in my kitchen," Madame Gloria continued. "I want to give the job to your daughter." Precious' heart leaped. "A job?" Her mother hesitated. "Madam, Precious is still young. She won't do anything stressful," Madame Gloria assured her. "And I will pay her weekly." Her mother turned to her. "What do you think, my daughter?" Precious nodded quickly. "I do it, Mama." She had no idea that this decision would change her life forever. That evening, after leaving the market, Precious hurried to Johnson's spot. She found him sitting with his back against the wall, his eyes closed, looking even weaker than before. She approached him with a small loaf of bread she had bought from the market. "Here," she said, placing it in his hands. His eyes snapped open in surprise. "You again?" Precious smiled. "Yes, me again." Johnson's hands trembled as he took the bread. "Why are you doing this?" "Because," Precious hesitated, then smiled. "Because I can." For the first time, Johnson smiled back. It was weak, but it was real. As Precious walked home that night, her heart felt light. She had a job. Her family had eaten well. And she had helped Johnson again. Things were changing. But life always had surprises. When she got home, she found her father sitting outside with his head in his hands. Her mother's voice was shaky. "Your father lost his tools, he can't walk anymore." Precious' chest tightened. Just when they had a glimpse of hope, another problem had come. Would Precious' new job be enough to save her family from another round of suffering? Or was this just the beginning of another hardship? Precious sat outside their small house, watching her father stare blankly at the sky. He looked lost, like a man who had been defeated by life. Her mother, sitting beside him, sighed. "Without your tools, how will we survive? The little money from the market is not enough." "I know," her father whispered, rubbing his tired eyes. Precious clenched her fists. She couldn't let them suffer again. She took a deep breath. "Mama, don't worry. I'll work hard at Madame Gloria's restaurant. I will help." Her mother's eyes softened. "You are just a child, Precious." "I am not just a child," she said firmly. "I can make a difference." She didn't know how, but deep inside, she felt things were about to change. At the restaurant, Precious worked harder than ever. She cleaned, served customers, and even helped in the kitchen. Madame Gloria watched her closely. One evening, she called her aside. "You are different, Precious," she said. You work with passion. Have you ever thought of going to school? Precious blinked. School. Madam Gloria nodded. You're smart. I want to help you. Precious' heart raced. Could this be real? Could she really go to school? But I have to help my family, she said hesitantly. Madam Gloria smiled. What if I told you I could help both you and your family? That night, Madam Gloria followed Precious home. When Precious' parents saw the wealthy woman standing in front of their house, they were confused. She sat with them and made an offer that left them speechless. I will sponsor Precious' education, she said. And I will also help your family get back on their feet. Precious' mother gasped. You mean, you will send my daughter to school? Yes. Madam Gloria smiled. I believe she is meant for something great. Precious couldn't believe what she was hearing. Was this really happening? The next morning, before going to work, Precious rushed to Johnson's usual spot. She found him sitting up for the first time in weeks, looking much better than before. He smiled when he saw her. My little angel. Precious sat beside him. I have good news. She told him everything about the job, about Madam Gloria, and about the opportunity to go to school. Johnson's eyes filled with tears. You see, my child. What you give to the world comes back to you. Precious felt warmth spread through her chest. Was this just the beginning of something even greater? What else did fate have in store for her? Precious stood in front of a large school gate, staring in disbelief. She had seen students in uniforms before, but she never imagined she would be one of them. Madam Gloria patted her shoulder. Are you ready? Precious swallowed hard and nodded. She was more than ready. Her parents had tears in their eyes as they watched her step through the gates. Make us proud, my daughter, her mother whispered. Precious turned to them and smiled. I will, Mama. She was no longer the girl who could barely afford a meal. She was now a girl with a future. One afternoon, after school, Precious passed by Johnson's usual spot. But he wasn't there. Her heart pounded. Had something happened to him? She searched the streets frantically. After a while, she saw an old man sitting outside a small shop, dressed in clean clothes. It was Johnson. He looked completely different, healthy, happy, and at peace. He saw her and smiled. I was waiting for you. Precious ran to him. You look so different. He chuckled. A kind man saw me and took me in. Gave me a job in his shop. Precious' eyes widened. You mean, you're no longer begging? Johnson shook his head. No, my dear. Just as you found a new life, I did too. Precious felt tears well up in her eyes. This was a miracle. That evening, Precious sat outside her house, looking up at the stars. Her life had changed. Her family no longer struggled. Her father had found a new job. She was in school. And Johnson was no longer begging. All of this, because of one small act of kindness. Her mother sat beside her. You see, Precious, she said softly. One good deed can change everything. Precious smiled. She would never forget this lesson. Moral lesson. No act of kindness is too small. A single good deed can start a chain reaction that changes lives. Thank you for watching till the end. Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe to this channel for more interesting videos like this.